It had already been 2 hours since the nurses wheeled the mom into the delivery room. Her contractions had gotten frequent now, but her midwife was nowhere in sight. She also noted the worried looks on the nurses and doctors. She could tell something was wrong. But her mother-in-law took matters into her own hands, not knowing what it would cost the family. Fiona Nettle knew she couldn't blame the woman, though. Everyone in the room was already antsy from the whole experience. Tensions had been running high for a while. "Fine," she heard Esmeralda, her mother-in-law, who'd been breathing down one of the nurses' necks earlier, intoned from the side. "I'll do it myself," and that's when everything went south. Fiona could remember the week she learned she'd be having a child. It had started with a day like any other, and she and her husband Robert were just about to have breakfast. The telltale morning sickness accosted her, and an oblivious Fiona thought she'd eaten something bad to warrant such a reaction from her body. But she'd soon learn it was something else. Fiona and Robert had always wanted to have a big family. They talked about it even before they tied the knot. For months they tried to have a child, but the world had turned a deaf ear to their pleas. Although none of them admitted it, they were slowly losing hope. And that was until that fateful day Sunday morning. Fiona had a slice of toast when her stomach sent up everything she'd had that morning and the night before. She tore to the bathroom and Robert quickly after her. "You okay?" he added, his face darkened with worry. Fiona nodded. She knelt before the toilet bowl. Might have been the snacks from the pantry, she theorized. She should have known her life was about to change forever. After a few minutes in the bathroom, the nausea that had taken over her body let up. Fiona got up and cleaned herself before returning to her morning routine. She still had errands to attend to and chores to do. A little sickness wouldn't put her down. She had no clue this would be a daily thing. The next day was a Monday and the couple woke up early ready for work. But just as Fiona was setting the table for breakfast, her stomach grumbled as nausea took over. But this time she didn't sprint to the bathroom, even though she could feel burning liquid rush up her throat. She stared blankly at her husband. She knew exactly what was happening. "I think I'm pregnant," she whispered, afraid to even utter the words. She didn't want to jinx it. "Really?" Robert jumped up, rushing to her. "Yes," Fiona answered as hope flooded her body. Her eyes grew wet, but she couldn't cry, not now. She needed to confirm the pregnancy before fully giving in. If only she knew it would end in a disaster. Fiona and Robert had a few pregnancy tests in their bedroom. After half an hour spent tending to Fiona's morning sickness, the hopeful mom-to-be took the test. She held her breath as she and Robert waited for the test to mature. The minutes were grueling, and the two couldn't stop pacing in their bedroom as they peeked at the test. "I think it's done," Fiona said and hurried to it. With bated breath, she snatched it from the sink and handed it to Robert. She couldn't look at it. With her fingers against her lips and her eyes wide, she stared at him. The air was tense with tension, the room itself waiting on Robert's answer, but even he couldn't speak. He dashed forward, sweeping Fiona into his arms and hugging her tightly, thanking her over and over again. She just made him the happiest man in the world. Fiona looked at the test. 2 lines, she mouthed, her tears finally falling free. That means positive. After months of trying, she and her husband had finally done it. Life couldn't be more perfect. The two took another test just to be sure and then drove to the hospital for a checkup. They were pleased when the doctor confirmed they were indeed expecting a child. Fiona called her parents and siblings while Robert called his. They also shared the news with their friends, letting everyone know that God had finally answered their prayers. But their joy would soon turn into heart-wrenching pain. Also, if you have not done so already, please subscribe to our channel and click that notification bell to get inspired by these real-life stories every day. Now, back to the story. The pain came from one person, Robert's mom and Fiona's mother-in-law, Esmeralda Keys. The woman was angry and offended because Robert was the one to tell her Fiona was pregnant instead of Fiona herself. Bubbling with anger, she called Fiona, telling her she didn't appreciate the treatment. Fiona couldn't understand the woman's point of view. She should have known this was only the beginning of the issue. Esmeralda and Fiona had always had a good relationship. She loved that Fiona had found the perfect balance between housewife and career woman. She loved how Fiona carried herself and adored that she made Robert happy. "You know," she'd said once, "I've never seen him look at anything or anyone the way he looks at you. So why would she be so cross now?" Well, Esmeralda shared that she'd thought she and Fiona were close. She'd believed their relationship transcended the mere mother-in-law-daughter-in-law paradigm. To hear the news of Fiona's pregnancy from Robert and not Fiona had been hurtful and outright disrespectful to her. "You'll pay for that," she said one evening while visiting, her face reduced to a grimace. Fiona would think she was joking until the day in the delivery room. 9 months passed faster than Fiona could count. The journey through those months had been like nothing Fiona had ever experienced. Everyone around her, from her doctor to her husband, had watched over her like she was a delicate egg. Robert had gone above and beyond for her, ensuring she felt loved and appreciated. He couldn't wait to be a dad. Before Fiona knew it, he was rushing her to the hospital. Fiona and Robert hurried to the hospital. Their baby boy was ready to greet the world. Of course, they told their friends and family that the moment was finally here. Fiona had even beaten back the pain of her progressing contractions to call and inform Esmeralda that her grandson was about to be born. Everyone hoped this day would end well for everyone involved. The nurses wheeled Fiona into the delivery room while Robert dealt with the paperwork. Afterward, he joined her in the delivery room where he was shocked to see his mom standing in one of the corners. Fiona didn't mind Esmeralda being in the room. She'd actually appreciated it and hoped this experience would bring them as close as they used to be. If only she'd known what her mother-in-law was planning to do. The nurses set everything up and an uncomfortable silence fell over the delivery room as everyone waited for the midwife to come. But soon enough it became clear something was wrong. For an hour, the nurses rushed in and out of the room, whispering in hushed tones and trying not to look worried. They kept glancing at Fiona and Robert too. What was happening? "Hey, is everything okay?" Robert asked the doctor, following him out. Esmeralda remained in her corner, as quiet as she'd been since she arrived. A few more minutes passed with nothing else happening, but Fiona's contractions were getting much harder to bear. Spikes of pain hit her after every minute, and she couldn't stop gritting her teeth. Why weren't the medical practitioners helping her? Fiona let out a shriek as the pain became too much. She'd been very patient since she got here, following every instruction the nurses gave her, but she couldn't take it anymore. Her contractions were getting more frequent. She wondered why they weren't telling her to push yet. That's when her mother-in-law took matters into her own hands and paid the ultimate price. Esmeralda stepped forward, taking off her jacket and rolling up her sleeves. She dashed to the sanitation tray and cleaned herself before hurrying to her daughter-in-law. With a serious look, she said, "I think it's time, honey." Fiona nodded. "It is time," she said, stamping down another shriek. Sweat had already drenched her body. "I think it's time too." "I'm gonna need you to push," Esmeralda said as she positioned Fiona. "Give it your all." Following the woman's instructions, Fiona started pushing. She felt like her body was no longer hers. Constant ticks of pain thrummed all over her and her mind was on fire. She could barely see clearly. "Push," her mother-in-law commanded. "Push!" Esmeralda shouted, and that's when the doctor and nurses barged in. "No, no," the doctor cried out, assessing what was happening. "What did you do?" A light-headed Fiona watched as the doctor, utterly horrified, stared at her body. She leaned in and let out a curse, turning around with a hand on her forehead. "What's wrong? What happened?" Her body still pained her and her mind was still on fire, but worry had washed away all the pain and agony. Esmeralda, who'd been confident before, stepped back, broad-eyed and shaking. She slumped on a seat lining the room's wall. What had she seen that it would cause such a reaction? "What's wrong?" Fiona asked again, summoning enough energy to shout out the words. The doctor looked up at her and said, "You weren't ready yet. There were a few unforeseen complications." She seemed to snap herself into reality, noticing she was supposed to act professionally and get the situation under control. That's when she did the unthinkable. The doctor asked Esmeralda to leave the delivery room, but in a shocking turn, Esmeralda agreed. Fiona wouldn't let that happen though. She held a hand out for the woman and begged the doctor to let her stay. "Doctor," Fiona asked with Esmeralda by her side, "you said there were complications. The pain is too much, but for my son I can take it. Tell me what's happening, please." The doctor dared to smile and said, "I don't know how we missed it, but you're expecting 2 babies, Fiona. But the condition of the second isn't as stable as the first. That's why we couldn't start the delivery. We were still trying to find the best way to deliver both infants without endangering their or your life, but it seems we're out of time." The midwife and nurses stepped in as the doctor was talking. They seemed to have figured out a way forward. They incorporated Esmeralda into the process and after 16 painstaking hours, welcomed 2 babies into the world. Esmeralda was the first to hold them as they entered. The first, Henry, was a healthy boy who had his dad's large eyes and mom's powerful vocal cords. The second, Esme, was an adorable girl with an unmatched beauty. Although she spent her first week in an incubator, she soon became strong enough to come into the world. Robert and Fiona drove home with their babies after the dust settled. Although delivery had been rocky, the parents had powered through it. They'd gone in thinking they'd only have 1 child when in reality they had 2. Fiona was glad. She was also thankful that her mother-in-law had seen her suffering and taken matters into her own hands. Although what she did was dangerous, Fiona knew the benevolent thought behind it was what mattered.